Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today I am once again celebrating Tag Thursday, this time by answering the reading taste tag. After I first saw Steve Donahue's version of this tag, I jotted down the questions and brainstormed about what I might answer. And then I finally sat down to watch the versions all of you have been making over the last couple of weeks. First, I watched Roz and her son Alf give their amazing answers and realized they had said everything I had thought to say and then some. They went far further than anything I had imagined. And as I watched more versions, I saw more and more echoes. So as I go along through these questions, I'll probably be mentioning how my answers fit with many of yours. I will try to link to everyone's tag videos that I reference down below in the description box. So, despite the fact that I have nothing to say that hasn't been said in response to these questions, here goes. Question 1. What is your favorite genre? I read a lot of what I'm going to call backlist fiction. Sometimes the earlier works written by contemporary authors, which are past their moments of intense media spotlight, but actually often works that have not been on current bestseller lists in many decades. Perhaps you might call them classics, from the ancient period, but especially from the 19th century and the early 20th century. Or perhaps you might, as Brian at Bookish teases, just call them snobby. I'll give my argument for why reading a lot of classics is not a snobby thing. It's usually quite easy to find very inexpensive used copies of old books, often free on Project Gutenberg or Kindle or whatever if you use an e-reader, and they're almost always available in the library as well, either on a tangible or virtual shelf with no long hold list. That's very much not true for new releases. To lay your hands on one of the books nominated for one of the big literary prizes, you have to make a much larger outlay of cash. So yes, the reason I read so many classics is because I'm cheap, not because I'm snobby. Yes? My other big genre is nonfiction, especially biography and memoirs, and especially literary biographies and memoirs. I've always read a lot of nonfiction, partly because of my former employment as an academic historian, but often just for pleasure. I've been especially devoted to nonfiction since the pandemic started affecting my world. I've read very few novels in the past 7 months or so, a change in my reading balance, which I don't think I ever would have predicted. Question 2. What is the most difficult genre for you to read? Roz and Alf at Scallydandling About the Books point out that there are really two potential meanings for this question. There are genres that are emotionally or intellectually unappealing to us. And then there are genres that we have more trouble understanding. I'll try to answer both parts. First, I very much dislike thrillers. I never like the anxiety that comes from sitting on the edge of my seat with serious threats waiting in all the wings. Detective stories, especially cozy mysteries, don't count in this category at all. I don't mind not knowing who the murderer is, but I don't want to be waiting for the scary thing to jump out at me. On top of that, I think I have read enough literature over the years that I can often predict where the general arc of the plot is going, and that makes all the positive excitement drain right out, just leaving the unpleasant anxiety of watching it all happen. Cousin at Always Doing says she doesn't get on with horror, and maybe that's what I'm really thinking about here when I say thrillers. I don't like violence in fiction, especially sexual violence or sexualized violence. Reading about violence in a historical or sociological way, or even in memoirs, can be a very different thing. But it's essential for me that any graphic violence has a serious overlay of context and a desire to understand it. For the other meaning of difficult genre, well, it isn't exactly a genre, but a class of books about a topic I really want to read about, but do not know background scholarship, etc. I suppose there are plenty of books in that category that I might find frustrating or off-putting. But what I remember most is how exciting it can be sometimes, at least occasionally, to read books that are incredibly challenging. A couple of decades ago, I remember reading an academic book by a professor of Jewish liturgy, Lawrence Hoffman. The book was called Covenant of Blood: Circumcision and Gender in Rabbinic Judaism. I knew pretty much nothing about the topic beyond the most basic cultural practice. But as I read the book, I felt like my head was expanding, exploding with new analytical abilities. Fundamentally, the book is a history of how particular interpretations of circumcision developed and changed over time within traditional Judaism. And it explored how a gender dichotomy evolved across discussions of circumcision blood and menstrual blood. This book is very much not about actual practice, but instead about close readings of rabbinic text and abstract understandings. And I did not know any details about the topic or anything about how this community of scholars talk to each other. While I did not particularly love the book, the experience of reading it was one of my very favorite and most exciting experiences ever, just because it stretched me to the absolute brink. Difficult, but in a really wonderful way. In her video version of this Booktube tag, Roz at Scallydandling alludes to the fact that she too really loves when books challenge her to see things in new ways. There are absolutely times when I want to read more comfortable books. In fact, the majority of times I want to read more comfortable books, but difficult books can be so much fun. The third question, what is your preferred age range? Based on the original tag creator's explanation, the question refers to literature targeted to specific age groups. Do we read young adult, middle grade, etc.? In general, when I'm reading for myself, I really read only adult fiction. Actually, I'll back up. I asked in my last weekly rambles, when thinking about Virginia Woolf's comments about George Eliot's Middlemarch, why Woolf chose to use the word grown-up rather than adult. There were several very interesting and thoughtful comments, which I really appreciate. A few of you also pointed out that adult entertainment might not always refer to what I like to indulge in. So perhaps I should say I tend to read grown-up fiction. Interestingly, I really love to read Bildungsroman, that is, books about how young people grow and mature into adults over time. While I think that in practice the current YA genre is concerned with different questions, I know when I first started reading, quote, adult fiction back when I was a preteen and teenager, I loved books like Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, a book which is in many ways a perfect book for the YA crowd. At some point, Kazan at Always Doing told me about a new genre, and I'm afraid I've forgotten what she called it. It's a story specifically about people who were post-YA, but still growing into their adulthood. Can any of you remind me what that genre is called? I suspect a lot of novels I read back then were a little closer to that genre or subgenre, even though I was a little too young. I still love Bildungsroman, and in fact, that grown-up book Woolf was referencing, Middlemarch, is at least partly a series of Bildungsroman about how various characters grow and mature from uncertain, idealistic young people into more settled adults. While I don't tend to read middle grade or YA novels for myself, I must say I really loved reading books with my son back when he was young, and even with my younger brother when he was a kid. Sometimes my son and I read aloud to each other, and sometimes we just talked about books we read separately. Reading is, of course, a private experience, but it's also a very communal experience sometimes, something we see when we read with our children or our spouses, with book groups, and, of course, especially here on Booktube. There are books I might not turn to or even enjoy without that communal connection. Summer at Cozy Reading with Quaker Cats mentioned something similar. I mentioned middle grade and YA when talking about these books I usually don't read for myself, but of course picture books and early readers and chapter books fit in here too, As Alba at Seriella points out, she mentions how much she loves reading funny books for children, whether with or without youngsters. Next prompt. Are you a character-driven or plot-driven reader? Between these two choices, I'm definitely a character-driven reader. I don't do well with novels that have an outlandish plot, but honestly, I'm fine with books that have basically no plot at all, as long as there are features of the story that cause a character to grow and change. Brian at Bookish points out how important it is for him to have characters he cares about. And I totally agree. Caring about doesn't mean liking, necessarily. Readers can care a great deal about what is happening to characters we don't like at all, but we have to be invested in their development. Honestly, I care so little about plot that often I don't remember what exactly happened in favorite books, even a few weeks after I've read them. I'll remember the characters in detail, at least the parts of them that I latched onto, and I might even remember specific passages that moved me. But the literal plot? What exactly happens? Nope. So definitely characters over plot. But as both Roz at Scally-Dandling About the Books and Doris at All the Books say, there are other parts of books that draw us in too, particularly themes, or particularly deep exploration of themes, often make me feel connected to books. And there are times when beautiful language, or an interesting writing style of some sort, even if it isn't beautiful at all, makes me love a book. The next prompt asks us what our preferred perspective is. Let me steer you to Al's discussion over at Roz's channel, Scally-Dandling About the Books, really for this question and the next, for something a bit more sophisticated than what I'm going to say, but so be it. I tend to like both first-person singular and third-person. When Alf pointed out that he especially liked third-person limited rather than omniscient, I realized that I totally agree with him, although I definitely would not have immediately been able to label it. I especially like when the narration shows us the inner thoughts of one character, but also has the liberty to show more aside from what the first-person character might know. Another narrative approach I really enjoy is when books have distinct sections written from very different first-person perspectives, or sometimes a combination of first-person and third-person perspectives. I've just been spending some time with William Faulkner, and he is definitely a master of the use of multiple perspectives in his novels. I promise to come back to that discussion in a future video, sometime next month perhaps. A narration style I almost always dislike, but find very interesting, is first-person plural. That is when the narrator is a we. A book that really intrigued me, even though I ultimately thought it was unsuccessful, is Weird Sisters by Eleanor Brown, where the three adult daughters of a Shakespeare scholar speak as a singular collective. I can't quite imagine how this kind of narration could be successfully sustained through a whole narrative. There's a very minor way of using that kind of narration that I find really wonderful, though. Matthew at Maybury Book Club talks about how we is used in the opening paragraphs of Flaubert's Madame Bovary, when the first-person plural refers to the community. Because this narration is not led by the main actors of the larger story, it can basically fade into third-person limited throughout most of the text. Okay, question 6. Do you have a preferred tense? I assume almost everything I read is written in past tense, but books in general feel like I'm reading them in the moment, in real time, that things are happening in the present tense. It's a funny thing. Perhaps it was Alf, I think, who talked about how a first-person narrator could use both present tense in the actual telling of the story and past tense in the actions of the story. And that sounds like a way to incorporate present tense without facing quite as many complications as an author might face if trying to write a novel completely in the present tense. That idea of using narrative tense as a way of embedding reflection or reevaluation in a text seems appealing. The next question. Do you like series or standalone books best? I almost exclusively read standalone books. Some of you have pointed out that even when you read books in a series, you want them to work as standalone books. I've definitely loved some series in which it's not essential to read the previous works in order to follow the plot, but that there's a slow development of character over the course of the series. I'm thinking about a lot of the detective stories I've loved over the years, as well as books like All Creatures Great and Small. Sort of related are books like Anthony Trollope's Barchester series, where each book is very much a standalone, but there are echoes and developments throughout that one would miss if one did not read them as a series. Incidentally, I say this as a person who has not yet read any of them, with the exception of The Warden. And I also like the idea of nonfiction series. For example, the multi-volume set of books about British history by Peter Ackroyd, which I keep thinking about reading. Any of you have anything to say about them? Yes? No? Prompt number 8. Which would you rather read, long or short books? Honestly, I've always been quite intimidated by books longer than about 500 pages. I get excited about reading them, but often they wind up sitting on my shelves as I pick up the shorter books surrounding them. When I do pick up long books, I really love the experience of being totally absorbed in another world for quite a while. And at the same time, I really love short novels, even novellas or short stories, both of which often stick with me just as much as the long novels do. When it comes to nonfiction, I think I prefer books on the shorter side. Several of you have talked about liking long historical works. And while that makes sense, I actually prefer more targeted works of history instead, books that focus in on very narrow topics and explore their broad ramifications. Usually this kind of work can remain relatively slim like 300 pages or so, instead of 800 or whatever. Right now, I have several very long literary biographies I really want to read, including the forthcoming biography of Sylvia Plath, which is enormous. Question 9. Which format do you like best? Well, in general, I like trade paperbacks. Because I like to write in my books, little check marks in pencil and other only somewhat regularized marks I've used for decades, paper works well. Ebooks have note-taking features, and those are fabulous, but my crazy little marks are not choices on a Kindle. Still, for really long and heavy books, e-readers are often terrific choices. For those with arm issues, which I've had at times, as have many other booktubers, e-readers can make reading possible, as Kazan points out. The same is true for readers with vision issues, including the simple vision issues that come with age, as Brian points out. And on top of it, as I think I said at the very beginning of this video, ebooks often mean it can be free to acquire a classic work. I'm not a serious fan of audiobooks, although I've recently gotten better at listening, especially nonfiction and rereads, and especially when I'm doing something quiet and focused, like knitting. And the last question, what are you currently reading? I am working my way through one of those long books, George Eliot's Middlemarch, which I'm loving and will be talking about more thoroughly sometime soon. I really ought to consider downloading an e-copy just so I can read in bed a little more easily. I do have an audiobook version checked out and narrated by the master reader Juliet Stevenson. It is beautiful, but Eliot's novel is so textual, with the dialogue taking a back seat to the more thoughtful words surrounding it, that I much prefer reading the words on the page. And with that in mind, I think it's time for me to go pick up Middlemarch right now. Thank you, Sophia, for putting together this great tag, and thanks to all of you for joining me here today on Hannah's Books. See you soon.